Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and with this video, I'll be discussing my thoughts on episode 7 of the anime series Shouwa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu Descending Stories. And holy hell, man. One of you guys called it out in the comments. I gotta give kudos where kudos are due. Talking about the PV for this episode attached to the previous, on my previous episode discussion video. One of you guys called it out in the comments that you suspected one of the things we would see in this episode was the real scenario as to how Sukeroku and Miyokichi died. And this was something that when I'd seen the PV, and there were a few aspects of this actual episode as they played out, where, you know, basically Yotaro is imagining things while he's watching the film that they found of Kikuhiko, the Yakumo, in his youth, and Sukeroku of old, and everything like that. He's imagining things, so that's kind of what I assumed those sequences were in the PV from the previous episode, that it was going to be imaginings, someone describing their theory of something, and Higuchi talks about at one point, you know, that's what he surmises. He doesn't really know for sure what all happened with all of that. But we get a lot more depth in his character as well, finding out what his impetus and drive has been, what his interest has been in the Yakumo. And it all goes back to Miyokichi, this woman he, I guess you could say, fell in love with, her beauty and her you know, just the suavity of her character and everything like that, the personality of this woman. And as an extension of that, when he found out she was, you know, dating and seeing Kikuhiko, or Rakugo performer, that's kind of what started the ball of interest rolling for him. And so when they're both talking about these things and they're remembering back and they're having these imaginings, when we saw that sequence in the PV of the last episode with Kanatsu and her, like, seeming to cry out in horror and seeing, you know, a sort of bloody Sukeroku, I believe is what we saw in the PV, I didn't immediately assume this was the reality that was, you know, the other leg was going to drop and that was going to be the reality of the scenario. And so when that happened, when we reached that point in this episode, it's like the teeter-totter tipped all the way over to one side, and I was just like dumbstruck. I'm just watching this horror, you know, this story that Yakumo had told to Yotaro and Kanatsu ages ago, and it's the same story he's been telling to Kanatsu all her life. To remove the burden of guilt and the weight of all of that from her shoulders, because she was arguably chiefly responsible for what inevitably happened to her father and mother. Now, granted, as we walk into the scenario, I'm a little sketchy, honestly, on how it originally was told by the Yakumo in the first season, how everything played out according to his storytelling of it. But for all intents and purposes, we walk in on Matsuda-san, who is, I love his character, the you know, the honor and the nobility and the, you know, wanting to be there for the Yakumo and how much the Yakumo means to him, his lineage, you know, he's just a beautiful all-around character, but it's very much up to him as to how we find all this out. And it is him who is describing the fact that we walk in on Kikuhiko, you know, cradling a dying Sukeroku, completely bloodied, after having, I guess, come under the attack of Miyokichi. And when Kanatsu is there, she's in tow, she sees this, and her first assumption is Kikuhiko, because of the love triangle, presumably, between these three people. She immediately assumes he is the one who attacked her father. But Miyokichi, you know, cowering in the corner, just talking and babbling and completely crushing under the weight of all the emotions and everything that just happened, she cries out, "No, Mommy stabbed Daddy." And we see Kanatsu just ever love and lose it, and she chases down her mother and just starts beating her mother, and it is she who leads her mother over the balcony's edge. Sukeroku, with the last vestiges of life in his body, reaches out, scrambles to grab her. Kanatsu following right behind. If it were not for Kikuhiko at that moment, the Yakumo at that moment, Kanatsu would have been gone too. It's horrifying. It was like a punch to the gut to lose these characters all over again, but now to find this cruel truth harbored at the center of that event was Kanatsu was there. And all her life she's been lied to by the Yakumo, but for a grander purpose, for the greater good, so that she would not be burdened by this and all of that hate she's harbored toward him, all that blame she's harbored toward him, because that's the way he wanted it. He wanted her to have someone else to blame rather than blame herself. She probably could not live with herself if she really remembered what happened. And all of this is revealed to Higuchi and, Yotaro in the present, who have gone to Miyokichi's and Sukeroku's graves, and we find that, of course, the Yakumo goes there every year on the anniversary of their deaths, and he's still, we've seen this before, he still has not been able to get past or beyond that. And I love how much sort of the lore of this series is ever present in this episode, because, of course, we're seeing the Yakumo is, sort of stealing away on the hospital grounds when he's supposed to be recuperating. He can barely talk. He feels like Rakugo has now moved beyond his capabilities. He equates it to feeling a level of satisfaction that Sukeroku once had with attaining his absolute pitched, perfect dream equivalent of what he was capable of, and that it would be all downhill from that point on, whether it would cease to exist or whether he just could never put his all into it as good as he had before, or in that moment, reaching that level of appreciation for his own talents. And here Yakumo, who has been, up until this point, so consumed with the idea that Rakugo, his version of it, will die with him, now he is beholden to the idea that it has escaped his grasp with this heart attack that he suffered, and no longer is it in him. And now that that's gone, what else does he have for himself? And the idea, the contrast that this is all playing out, he's bearing his soul to Kanatsu, who's kind of very aloof about it, and like she's acting very much like she could care less, like, oh, you're pathetic, listen to you, old man, and everything. And to think, one health scare would make you walk away and give up Rakugo, all that kind of stuff. Like this is, I guess you could say, arguably the closest she can be to supportive, while still harboring ill will toward him to an extent. But as we saw, a lot of that is a facade. She did not want to lose this man yet. And it's very important to Yotaro and Matsuda-san and Shin to want to be able to see him continue in some way, by some means, and to contrast that with the past. The beauty that was beholden in the entire sequence, especially when they're zoning in on Yotaro. But I mean, Higuchi, Matsuda-san, they're all there watching this old film reel captured of Kikuhiko and Sukeroku of old, and the fact that they're brought to tears, the fact that they find it so resounding. But when they keep closing in on Yotaro, I mean, he was almost emotionless. He was stoic, because he was letting every ounce of it wash over him. He was putting himself in the place of the audience at the time and really living in that moment, really feeling what that felt like, something he has dreamed of since before even being taken under the tutelage of the Yakumo. Going back to when he was still a prisoner and he found Sukeroku's Rakugo of old, the old recordings, and he fell in love with it and he wanted to pursue this. I mean, it all comes full circle for him. But then you have that end cap revelation coinciding with Higuchi revealing his own impetus and driving force behind all of his interest in Yakumo. How there's almost a salacious quality to it. Like, here is the man that took Miyokichi. In some way, shape, or form, he was involved in taking her, whether it means from Higuchi, from me, from my wants, my desires, or from taking her out of this world. He played a part in that. And all the while, Higuchi and Yotaro, they've been operating under specious assumptions. In Higuchi's case, a complete assumption. But at least Yotaro had been told some version of this story by the Yakumo. Come to find through Matsuda-san's words that it was all a lie. And that there was something much more deep-seated and horrific at the center that tied back to Konatsu, for him to come home, for Yutaro to then return home, and he can't tell her. He shouldn't tell her, really. I don't think he should. Or at least if he does, I think he should wait until after Yakumo passes away. I wouldn't want to see a falling out at this juncture between them, because Konatsu would probably be horrified. She might want to take her own life, you know. She might explode at the Yakumo, and I don't want to see that kind of falling out for these characters who have grown to love and be so interconnected with each other. But to see him speechless and denying her when she's asking, what did the old man do? What got you so emotional? You're crying about everything lately. And he can't let go of her for that revelation of the part she played in it. And it just broke my ever-loving heart. It was a shock, and it brought me to tears. And I was like, my God, we've all been operating under a specious assumption all along. This twist in the tale, this rose-colored veil cast over the truth by Yakumo, who really is at his heart a selfless individual. For all of his begrudgingness, for all of his orneriness, for all of his acting as though Rakugo dies with me. You know, I mean, there is some part of that is true to his nature, but underneath all of that shell, all of that facade, is a man who truly cares. He saved Konatsu's life by actually gripping onto her body and saving it, but also emotionally being the bearer of the burden of the lie of who took her parents' lives when it was she who played that role. Because he could not bear her growing up with that stigma, with that guilt. She may have had no life at all. And now she here has a son of her own, a husband who desperately cares for her and wants for her well-being and all these things, a happy life. And it's because of the Yakumo's choice to unburden her, to remove that burden from her and take it upon himself. It's just, wow. This series is wow. I mean, from beginning to end. And what a hell of an episode. As always, as usual, living up to what this series is capable of achieving, emotionally impactful-wise, weaving a grandiose and moving story, and it was just torrential. And it's like I'm speechless by the end of it, you know. Just wow. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below. If you've seen this particular episode of Shouwa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu, Descending Stories as well, episode 7, what you thought of it, if you found it as impactful and moving and emotional as I did, you know, what your own perspectives on it are. Always love having that conversation. Love it or hate it, anything goes in the comments below. And so, yeah, otherwise, that'll be pretty much it for me on this. Hope this video finds you well. And I'll catch you all later. Peace.